My name is Lisa Sharon Harper, and I'm the founder and president of Freedom Road, LLC. We are a consulting group. I also host the Freedom Road podcast, and I'm co host of the Four podcast. I've authored several books, most recently, The Very Good Gospel, How Everything Wrong Can Be Made Right, and Fortune, How Race Broke My Family and the World, and How to Repair It All. Your Vote, Your Voice is co sponsored by Bread for the World, the League of Women Voters, and the Laurel Oak Farm, based in Butler, Pennsylvania, y'all. So tonight we gather less than 2 weeks from Election Day, November 5th, but we have been voting early here in Pennsylvania since early October. Things are confusing this year. There's lots of misinformation and disinformation out there causing confusion. So, it seems like the world, in addition to all of that, is on fire with competing values that are pulling for our loyalties, some of them domestic and others in foreign policy. And so some folks are fighting the temptation just to bury heads in the sand and close eyes and sleep through November 5th. And I really do understand that, but we cannot do that. We must engage. The future of our nation is literally at stake and in this election. And as much as our nation will choose whether or not it wants to remain a democracy in this election, we also have the power, really over the next few weeks, to choose a beautiful future, a future with enough for all. So, with these high stakes, our co sponsors have come together to offer this opportunity to have a public conversation rooted in our faith to help equip the church to cast its votes with discernment and clarity. So, with no further ado, I'd love to introduce to you our panelists for the evening. The first panelist I want to introduce is Reverend Heather Taylor, who is a JD, Juris Doctor, Doctor of you know what I mean, the law. She is managing director of Bread for the World, a Christian advocacy organization urging U.S. decision makers to do all they can to pursue a world without hunger. Reverend Taylor oversees Bread's public policy and program divisions in developing grassroots mobilization and communication strategies to inspire faith communities, policymakers, and partners to engage in Bread's mission to end hunger. She has represented Bread making guest TV appearances on CNN, C-SPAN, CBN, Scripps News, and Cox News outlets. Thank you for being here, Reverend Heather Taylor. Reverend Lee R. Scott is a minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA, agriculturalist and seasoned human resources professional with a diverse background in management consulting, ministry, and farming. Lee holds a Master of Science in Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon University and a Master of Divinity from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Bringing a strong academic foundation to his professional endeavors, he and his wife are the owners of Laurel Oak Farm, a family-owned beef operation focused on reconnecting people with food, family, and the land. Welcome, Reverend Lee R. Scott. Dr. Drew G.I. Hart is an associate professor of theology at Messiah University and has 10 years of pastoral experience before teaching. He currently directs Messiah University's Thriving Together Congregations for Racial Justice program and co-hosts Inverse podcast with Jared McKenna, an award-winning peace activist from Australia. Hart is the author of Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, which was published in 2016, and Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance, published in 2020. He's also a co-editor and contributor to the recently published book, Reparations and the Theological Disciplines, Prophetic Voices for Remembrance, Reckoning, and Repair, which was published November 2023. Drew and his family live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Drew G.I. Hart. Reverend Dr. Gregory Edwards serves as the interim executive director of Power Interfaith in Philadelphia. His journey also includes being an organizer with Power Lehigh Valley, regional director and chief of staff. Um, Reverend Edwards is also the founder and senior pastor of the Resurrected Life Community Church, United Church of Christ, and president and CEO of the Resurrected Community Development Corporation. Dr. Edwards currently serves as board chair for Promise Neighborhoods of the Lehigh Valley and board member for the Community First Fund, the financially largest community development financial institution in central Pennsylvania and the Lehigh Valley, focused on improving the economic well being of historically marginalized and underrepresented communities in eastern Pennsylvania. Now, later, you will hear from Dr. Amy Widestrom, who holds a BA from Oberlin College and an MA and PhD from Syracuse University. She has also been the recipient of several awards, including the 2016 American Political Science Association's Clarence Stone Scholar Award, a Brookings Institution Research Fellowship, and an American Political Association Congressional Fellowship in 2008 to 2009, when she worked for the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs as the nation worked to recover from the 2008 economic crisis. So, thank you, everyone, for being with us today. Let's dive in. The first question that I'd like to ask you today is, can you tell us the story of the first time that you voted? And let's start with Reverend Dr. Heather Taylor.
Advice. And so my only hope was whether or not there would be somebody who went to our university to reach out to us and to educate us about voting and what was required. And I was able to participate. It's also one of many reasons why I'm so passionate about educating voters about what they need to do, what the rules are, empowering our young people who very much have a voice and deserve to participate in this election and have the ability to shape the election outcome. Why it is that we utilize present day, fast forward decades later, present day technology to spread the word.
Amen. Wow, that's awesome. Let's move now to Reverend Lee Scott. Reverend Lee Scott, tell us a story.
So I grew up in a small town, and I remember the first time I voted, it was 2002, and it was all local elections, right? And there were a number of things that just didn't have anybody next to the position. So I wrote in my own name for township assessor, and then came out of the voting booth and said to my mom, "Hey, I wrote myself in for township assessor. Why don't you do that too? And we'll see what happens." And lo and behold, like I get a notice in the mail a month later saying, "Congratulations on having been elected township assessor of Jefferson Township, Butler County." Now, the good news for the homeowners of Jefferson Township is that Pennsylvania appropriately passed legislation in the middle of the 20th century to make sure that if you weren't trained on assessing property values, you weren't actually going to do it. But it opened up for me a realization of how important those down ballot races are for just general participation in the democratic process. Everything from local tax collector and building relationships with the folks that have those positions, all the way up to getting to know your state representative, your congressional rep, etc. So there's ways to participate in really, at least for me, unexpected ways.
Wow. Wow. How about that? Like you literally wrote yourself in and got a job. That's incredible.
Didn't pay anything, but it was a good experience.
Thank you. Let's move to Reverend Dr. Gregory Edwards.
So I think the first time I voted was in, I'm gonna give away my age. 19, it was 1987. It was the 1987 election, and it was George Herbert Walker Bush
Uh-huh.
versus Michael Dukakis. And I can remember it was rather uneventful. I will tell you, given the current political cynicism and oftentimes shame that's placed upon many young folk for not knowing civics 101, I can remember being a little confused.
Mhm.
Folk in my family vote by rote. There was no mail-in ballot. I grew up in a very small, working class, rural town in Northwest New Jersey. Um,
Mm.
didn't really have anybody to guide me. There were no seminars. I knew I was 18, had to find my way to the polling place. I had just gotten my license. I wanted to vote. There was a lot of dog whistling in the presidential election of 1987, if you
Mhm.
recall. I was uh, a uh, a person that was deeply committed, even at a young age, to racial justice. And so to walk into a polling place where the poll workers did not look like me, I was
Mhm.
already confused, didn't know what I had to do, didn't know if I had to get out my driver's license. Folk weren't overly helpful or friendly, but I went there. I wrote in and filled in that ballot, and was very happy to have done so. Even though I'm going to be honest with you, my knees were shaking. I mean, I think those of us who are super voters, we take it for granted how intimidating it is for young folk or for first time voters to go into a place that is unknown, sometimes a church,
Yep.
sometimes a school, sometimes a government or municipal building, right? With a
Mhm.
piece of paper. I mean, thank God for melon ballots, but think about how overwhelming that can be for an 18-year-old unless they come from a family or have a narrative that has already politicized them, right?
Mm.
That has
Mhm.
already politicized them. So if you don't have some internal mechanisms to overcome some shame, I
Mhm.
get why a lot of our folks, specifically our young folks, are rightfully cynical and they don't have a lot of folks shepherding them to the polls. I wish I had someone that said, come on, I'll walk with you, I'll take you. The older generation had already voted.
Yeah.
Um, but I kind of went by myself and have been
Mm.
going by myself and taking my siblings and my children since then. But I can remember that first time. It was like I tell you this, Lisa. It was almost like the first day of school in a different
Yes.
way. It was like the first. That's the only
Mhm.
thing I can think about in terms of the emotional comparison of going to school for the first time. Of course, you're an adult, you know how to read and write, but you're
Mhm.
doing a thing for the first time and you don't necessarily know how to do it, right?
Mhm.
And you don't know to go to the right, to the left, somebody talks to you, they ask you for an ID. So it was a little overwhelming, but I felt so good after
Mm.
having done it. I remember getting into my car and going, "Yes!" Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There was some level of I did this thing. I overcame a level of shame and some fear, and I made my voice my vote during that presidential election.
That's so fabulous. I mean, I think for me, I mean, when I think back to when I first voted, I think I voted in that same election. That was my first time voting. I thought it was 2000, not 2000, 1988. Was it 1988? Because that was for me the first time I ever voted. And I remember I had just watched Glory, the movie Glory, and watching Glory, I had learned that my great, 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 great grandfather, no, four greats, my four times great grandfather fought in the Civil War. And and his brother fought in the 54th. So after learning that my family had actually literally fought and died and bled, although he didn't die, but he bled in the 54th for my ability to be free and to vote, I stood in line at the voting, the election place, the polling place, which was a frat house at Rutgers University. And I remember I was the closer I got to the actual voting booth, I started to cry. Just I just tears were coming and I couldn't stop because I felt like I was a part of something much bigger than me. And I feel like that every time. I actually pretty much cry every time I go to the voting booth now because I feel like this is my chance to enter into the whole and be a part of something larger than myself. So Very, very cool. Thank you guys so much. So we are going to, I'm going to remove the spotlight for myself, and we're going to ask the second question now. So the second question is, what does voting mean to you as a person of faith? So I'd like to start this time. Let's go backwards. Let's start with Reverend Dr. Edwards and go backwards. So what does voting mean to you as a person of faith?
I mean, so voting for me is a kind of public prayer, right?
Mm,
We live in a civil society. We're trying to work for a more perfect union. The only way we can really coexist with the fabric of America being so diverse is to be accepting of religious plurality. And
mhm,
yet we're all trying to build, we should be trying to build a multiracial democracy. And we should be trying to build, a country that inherently believes, I don't have to believe what you believe to believe that you belong.
mm, mhm.
And voting is a belonging. It's kind of a belonging, right?
Yeah, that's
It's
good.
it's it's a voting is sacred to me because as you told the story, I think about all of the elders who are now ancestors and all the ancestors in my faith tradition and that great
Mhm,
cloud of witnesses, the Fannie Lou Hamers, the
mhm,
James Lawsons, the
mm.
John Lewises, the Malcolms, the Martins, right? The
Yeah.
Ella Bakers, that we have a divine obligation, and everyone may not have the courage or the intel to be able to stand up and speak out publicly at a school board meeting, at a city council meeting. Maybe everyone doesn't have the requisite knowledge to be able to run for political office,
Mhm,
but to be able to cast your vote on the basis of what you believe inherently to be right and what
mhm.
aligns with your morals, your values, and your ethics, that to me is a kind of public civic prayer, right? It's a kind of
Yeah.
prayer that is being cast on behalf of the things that I value and the people that I love, right?
Mm,
So I show
mhm,
up for myself because there's a lot at stake for me, but I also show up for the folks that came before me who marched, fought, bled, died, water hoses, German shepherds, right? And
yep.
the list goes on and on. So to me, it's a divine obligation and it's sacred. It's a sacred duty, right? As a person of faith.
Wow, wow, thank you so much. Let's move to Dr. Drew Hart.
Yeah. And I didn't have an opportunity to share my story. So I'll
Oh
start
my
there
goodness.
first. That's all right. I'll share that and then I'll kind of share a little bit about what voting means to me. But the
Please
very
do.
first time that I got to vote, I actually did not vote the very first two times I had the opportunity to, which would have been starting college in 2000, and then in 2004, when I was wrapping up college. I didn't vote then. And in many ways, Reverend Edwards was talking about some folks are not politicized. I was not at that point.
Mm,
During college, certainly was becoming more attuned, certainly to racism personally, and becoming passionate about it. But the way that I was thinking about it and was introduced to the subject in my Christian college still wasn't really politicized. It was individual, right, responses and getting people together. But when since then, I had read, I was engaging in Black theology, went on civil rights bus tours, all kinds of stuff was going on. And I moved
mhm,
back to Philly. And so 2008 was actually my first election that I was able to participate in. And so I still can remember just the excitement, the energy, the feeling like I was participating in a historic moment.
mhm,
And so I, in some ways, even remember the sitting in my living room watching the electoral process, even more than just the going in and voting, just because of just kind of taking in the historic moment that it was.
mm,
So anyway, yeah, that was some of my first experience voting. For me, though, when I think about voting and what it means to me, I guess I can think about, I mean, I'm a theologian, so I think first and foremost, like theologically, that,
mhm,
the gospel of Jesus Christ is inherently political, right? It's about God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And so, what does it mean to have this counter insurrection begun in the person of Jesus Christ, right?
mhm,
We're the first are last, the last are first. We're the least, last, lost, and little ones. We're poor people, oppressed people, vulnerable women, Samaritans, right? The outsiders are prioritized and are central to all that Jesus is doing. And so I think for me, to recognize that the gospel of Jesus Christ is not neutral. It takes sides, and is the lens through which then I think about political engagements in a whole variety of ways, from the kind of political engagement, 365 out of the year, seeking to work with, collaborate, organize with neighbors to make a difference. But even bigger than that, I think for me, because I have a vision of shalom, particularly Isaiah's vision, right, of all of creation, where justice, righteousness, peace, joy, flourishing, security, right? No more exploitation or terror, because all of those things is a vision that I have for society, human flourishing. It's really helpful for me to kind of think about how I want to participate in our pluralistic society in ways that doesn't dominate, crush, try to control others, but ultimately seeks the thriving and flourishing of others. So I guess the pragmatic side of that then is, for me, voting. I don't expect the most politicians nor parties to be in breaking the kingdom of God. But what I do believe is that when I vote, it's my opportunity to influence our society to take either a step in the right direction towards that vision of shalom, or at times it's also to preserve the bits of justice and righteousness that we have in our society that could be lost because the powers are in rebellion to what is good and God's dream for us, right? And so I think for me, a lot of times when I'm voting, I'm thinking about what's that next step towards more justice that we can kind of work towards, or when things are dire, right? How do I preserve and care for, those that are most vulnerable in my community?
So great. So great, Dr. Hart. And I'm so sorry to miss you on the first
No
round.
problem.
Please forgive me, brother. So let's hear next from Reverend Lee Scott.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really inspired by both of these initial testimonies on a sense of inner interacting with our faith and our civic participation. So for me, the gospel really comes home when it transforms how I think, how I live, how I interact with the whole world around me. From the very practical of the gospel should have some implications on how I farm, on how I work as a leader in my organization, on how I parent. That also means it should have some significant implications on my civic participation and on my civic witness, frankly. Um, I do think that Christians can find their ways around to a lot of different supportive candidates. I have some friends who are monarchists in the sense that they believe Jesus is king, and they're not that citizenship is primary, so they abstain from voting. I personally disagree with that perspective, but I've heard recently at a conference in Chicago, theologian Miroslav Volf was quoted as saying, like, Christians should be unreliable political allies. And I take that to mean we should really see that the work of the kingdom is our priority. And so we should seek to find common ground with folks who will provide pathways for us to put more signposts to the kingdom in the ground. And so I think it's inherently a part of our witness as believers and as in many ways everybody on this call leaders within our congregations and our communities to take inspiration from the words of Abraham Lincoln said in Pennsylvania at the Gettysburg Address: we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if that is the case, then the people in this country are the sovereigns. There is no earthly king or dictator in the United States of America. It is the people who have a responsibility for shaping the democracy, the republic that we have. And that should be informed by how the gospel has transformed our perspective for common good for one
Mm.
another.
So good. Oh my goodness. Y'all, this is so worth the price. Which was free, but you know what I mean. So, Reverend Heather Taylor, please share with us your thoughts on the meaning of voting for you.
Amen and amen to all that has been shared here already. You know, we have a saying at Bread that may actually come from our president, but quite simply, it is that God cares about people and policies impact people.
Mm,
Therefore, we should engage in public policies that are being put forward.
mm,
By participating in the election and in the voting cycle, we have the ability to ensure that we are putting leaders in place that are putting forward policies that can have a tremendous impact in our home state of Pennsylvania, as well as across the nation.
mhm,
This webinar is entitled Your Vote, Your Voice. I also think about being created in the image of God, Imago Dei.
mhm,
The vote is an expression of our voice, of the God in me, the way in which we prayerfully come to this and to the best of our ability to be able to vote and express our values in the election process.
mm,
I also think it's important that for me, personally, as a person of faith, that when I go to the polls, when I am voting, I'm not just thinking about my own self-interest. What's good for
mhm,
Heather? Of course, I consider self. But how do I love my neighbor in this election cycle? What does it mean for the people who are around me? And when I think about certain statistics, like 1.5 million, some statistics say people in the state of Pennsylvania are facing hunger, that nearly 28% of folks fall under what is something that is called the ALICE category, or asset limited, income constrained, and employed. That's a wonky way of saying we've got folks who are working, still can't put food on the table.
mhm.
We have folks who are working, still may not be able to meet basic needs. And so what can I do as a citizen, as a voting individual, as a participant in our politics to better ensure and love my neighbor?
Amen. Wow. Thank you so, so much for that, Reverend Taylor. I think for myself, I think everyone went this time, right? So for thank you. You actually spoke exactly directly to what I would have shared and what I will share just briefly. Um, for me, I think that the main question is the question of the image of God. When I think about voting, what strikes me about it is that in a democracy, voting is the most basic way that human beings get to exercise stewardship of our nation, stewardship of the world. Voting is the most basic way to be human in a democracy. Because on the first page of the Bible, it said very clearly, God, let us make humankind in our image and likeness, and let them exercise dominion. And that word image is representative figure. And so we are representative figures of God on earth. We're all walking around as like the proclamation that God rules here. And let them exercise dominion. So there's a shared dominion. There's God who has God's dominion, but we as human beings, part of what it means to be human is to exercise stewardship of the world, to exercise agency, make choices that impact the world. So the vote is the most basic way to exercise our humanity, to be human. And we get to do that in a democracy, on a governmental level, I mean. And so for me, it's sacred because of that. Because when we suppress the vote or squash or eliminate the vote, the ability for some to vote, what we're really doing is attacking their humanity. So what we need to be doing as people of faith and as humans is fighting for easy access to the polls so that more images of God can fully flourish and grow fully into their call to exercise stewardship of this land. And it kind of really does dovetail with everything everyone else has said. I think especially of what Reverend Scott said about all of us being sovereigns. Yes, all of us are called to steward our nation. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask us to kind of fold the last two questions into each other and answer them as one question. And let's take 1 minute to share because we want to get to our training, which is coming up next. What is at stake in this election for you? When you think about this election, what comes to mind first for you in terms of what is at stake? And as a result of what is at stake, what is your voting plan? How do you plan to exercise stewardship in this moment? And whoever would like to go first can go.
So I can
Okay.
add that. So I mean, what's at stake is, you know, the elimination of the Department of Justice, the elimination of the Department of Education, the weaponization of the office of President of the United States.
Mhm.
You turn back in time to a notion of this deeply mythologized America that was purportedly good for all, but really only good for a few handful of folk.
Mm.
What's at stake? I've got 4 adult, beautiful children, 9 grandchildren. What's at stake is that the next 2 generations will have to dig their way out of the public policies that the next president will have to make if the wrong person sits behind the resolute desk. And I have a responsibility not just to be a good father and a grandfather, but live into the destiny of one day becoming a good ancestor. And I want my
Ooh.
children and my grandchildren to think that I made a difference in how I showed up and took other folks with me on November 5th. My voting plan, I certainly support mail-in ballots, but there's something inside of me that drives me to the altar, if you will, the altar of showing up and voting. I got to have the piece of paper in my hand,
Yes.
and I got to go in and look at folks' faces when they give me that ballot, not because I'm distrusting of mail-in ballots, but because there's something about the getting up and going to the polling place. So I'm going to get up at 6:30. I'm going to get myself dressed. I want to be the very first. I'm usually the very first person in line.
Oh
Uh,
my goodness.
and I'm going to cast my ballot, and then I'm going to go and take off my day of work, and I'm going to do some knocking on doors up until I'm all knocked out.
Woo!
So that's my voting plan, and I'm gonna make sure that all of the folk in my immediate household, immediate family, also do the same.
Amen. Thank you so much. Who'd like to go next?
I'll chime in.
Okay.
So I think it's also important to remember that what's at stake is that in addition to this being a presidential election, as we know, that we have some 468 seats that are up in Congress. Now, when we look at that locally in the state of Pennsylvania, it's not, but we're all engaging in discussions with our families and our friends.
Mm.
And it is important to look at the platforms that these individuals are putting forward. Because like I know my fellow panelists have been in this long enough to know that how someone identifies on their face may or may not have anything to do with what they actually do when they are in office. So
Mhm.
looking objectively, thinking about the policies that have impact, how do they articulate them, and then making a vote accordingly. So it is critical to remember, as important as this presidential election is, that we also have some 460 plus seats that are up. I did actually mail in my ballot. I dropped it off on Friday, October 11th. It was a very exciting day for me. I checked pretty much every day until finally it was confirmed online that it is indeed received. It was received as of October 15th. So we know it was about a 5 to 6 day lag time. And it was mailed out to folks on the 4th. But I did mail it in. A part of my plan is also to volunteer as a poll observer. So there's still opportunities for those of you who are interested, would like to sign up for trainings. This is one of the lead reasons why I chose to mail in, so that I could be available on the day of, to be a calming presence, to be a witness as a person of faith, but also an engaged citizen in this process.
That is so fabulous. Thank you so much, Reverend Taylor. Who else would like to go?
I'll jump in.
Okay.
So I want to confess that this is a little bit of a self-serving piece, but what is abundantly and in front of my face at stake in this election is the future of rural America. I am concerned about the continued distance that most in our country have from where their food comes from, and the way in which we've just become like in a expectation that it just happens. But there are considerable challenges in rural life, ranging from, the challenges associated with fentanyl to lack of access to things that are as simple as getting an ambulance to your house in less than a half an hour, and that ambulance EMT is adequately trained, the future of rural health, the continued aging of the farmers and ranchers in this country, and the lack of access to credit for younger folks that want to get into agriculture. So this is something that I'm very passionate about, and there is an absolutely phenomenal 15-page plan for rural America. The Harris Walls campaign debuted last week. It is awesome. If there is, I mean, I grew up in an era that basically said Democrats had given up on rural areas, and this is anything but that. And so for me, the future of our rural regions across the country is at stake in this election. And so that's really front and center for me. As for me, I sympathize with Reverend Dr. Edwards. I want to be there in person. I want to make sure that I have actively done something that day. And so I will be heading down to my polling place, and looking forward to doing in person, hopefully being able to bring my daughter with me.
Fabulous.
That's good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think we are at Drew Hart.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So for me, when I think about the question, what's at stake? I mean, as they say, stakes are high, right? I think that certainly one of the obvious things for me that I'm concerned about is just the rise of white Christian nationalism and the way that the MAGA movement is deeply aligned with that, and the way that it is really an anti-democratic vision. And that really is a pushback against the pluralistic society that we live in. And so I think that for me, that's one of the big concerns that I have. But I'm also concerned about, I mean, the trends just over the last few years in terms of, you know, education around just the history of our nation, the founding of our nation, around slavery and genocide, and being able to talk about that truthfully, the smothering of anti-racist work, mislabeling critical race theory, the stereotyping of immigrants in our country. I think all of those things are at stake. And even in more complicated questions where, I can have frustration with even the Harris Walls campaign as it relates to Palestine, right, in Gaza, I'm very, very aware that when I think about what are the better conditions for organizing and protesting on those issues, who's going to be most receptive, I'm pretty convinced that that's going to be Harris and Walls, and it's not going to be Trump, right? And so I think that lives are at stake globally as well as here. And that I think that we need to take those things seriously. As far as me, my plan shifted fairly recently, and Lisa, you actually influenced it a little bit
Hey.
because of our last conversation that we had on the phone. So I always have gone in person. And then Lisa's like been over my shoulder a little bit because you were just talking about, encouraging some folks to do mail-in ballots because in case there's some funny business going on, some obstruction, that can be one way to kind of avoid that. So just recently, I applied for my mail-in ballot tentatively, cautiously, nervously. But I am planning to do that. And so I'm looking forward to it coming in soon and me responding and getting it out immediately. Yeah.
Fabulous. Wonderful. How about that? I'm honored that I get to be part of your story. For my plan is actually to walk in my mail-in ballot on October 27th as part of a big Souls to the Polls engagement here in Pennsylvania. So that's my plan. I normally am like Reverend Dr. Edwards. I religiously go on election day and love standing in line and getting to know my neighbors who are working behind the polling areas. But on this occasion, I will be walking it in. So thank you so much to our panelists for sharing with us your heart, your story, your mind. And now we want to shift over into a time of more formal training with Dr. Amy Widestrom. So I'm going to ask everyone else to please go off camera. And Dr. Amy Widestrom, if you would come on, I'm going to give you the spotlight. And we just ask you, please let us know what we need to know in order to vote effectively in Pennsylvania.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to talk about this. I'm going to share my screen so folks can see the information that I'm talking about. I hope everyone can see that. The first thing that I want to just note is to tell people who we are in case they don't know who we are. So I'm the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. We are part of a federated organization. So we have a national office in Washington, D.C., a national organization. We've got 50 state leagues across the United States, and we have more than 700 local leagues or local chapters. So we've got 30 local chapters or local leagues in the Commonwealth here in Pennsylvania. We are nonpartisan. So my job, my mission is to empower voters and to protect everybody's access to the ballot and their right to vote. And so we register everybody who wants to register. We make sure every vote counts, regardless of who anybody's voting for. And so I'm really here wearing my nonpartisan hat and making sure that everybody has the information that they need to vote on November 5th or before, if you're planning on doing that. And I also just want to highlight that we're not just for women. We grew out of the women's suffrage movement. We were founded in 1920, but we have members who identify across the gender spectrum. We serve all voters, regardless of if you're a man or a woman. So we are not just for women. We are here to help all voters have the information they need to be empowered to vote. So the first thing I want to highlight is who can register. And the only reason I really want to flag this for folks is that, there's some mis and disinformation circulating around who's registered to vote in the state of Pennsylvania and in the country. And so you need to be a citizen for at least 30 days before the election. You have to be a resident of Pennsylvania and your election district for at least 30 days before the election. And you have to be at least 18 years of age on election day. So 17-year-olds can register to vote as long as they're 18 on election day. It's also important to note that behind the scenes, the Department of State checks a whole host of federal and national databases to ensure eligibility. So to ensure those citizenship requirements are met and residency requirements are met. So there's a number of safeguards in place to make sure that only those who can register and are registered to vote. There are 3 ways that you can vote in the state of Pennsylvania, and we've heard some of them referred to in the presentations today and in the discussion today, and it was so wonderful hearing everybody's stories and their plans to vote. The number one thing that I'm here to encourage everybody to do is make a plan to vote, whether it's by mail, early in person, or on election day. We know that people who make a plan, they put it on their calendar, they tell a friend, they tell their family. We know that they're more likely to vote when they make a plan to do it. So please make a plan to vote if you haven't done so already. You can vote in person on election day. Oh, I see a missing word there. You can vote in person on election day. You must vote in your precinct, so where you are registered to vote. You cannot just go to any precinct to vote. It is the case that if you show up at the wrong precinct and you cannot get to the right one, you can vote using a provisional ballot. You always have the right to vote. That is important to know. But it would be on a provisional ballot. So make sure you go to your precinct where you are registered to vote. You can vote by mail. You can request a no excuse mail-in ballot. The deadline is October 29th. Although I will say that is 7 days before election day. And so if you submit that request 7 days before election day and you wait for it to come in the mail, then you fill it out and mail it back in, that's cutting it really close. So if you know you're going to vote by mail and you haven't requested that already, I would go ahead and request that ballot now. They have to be, all mail-in ballots and absentee ballots have to be submitted by 8 p.m. on election day on November 5th. This isn't stamped, like it's stamped and you put it in the mail on election day. It has to be in the hands of the county by 8 p.m. on election day. That's a really important thing to note. You can also vote in person at your county election office or a satellite election office if you have one, using a mail-in ballot. So you can vote early in the state of Pennsylvania to the extent that you can walk in, request a mail-in ballot in person, fill it out, and then you have to seal it as though it would be a mail-in ballot. You have to put it in your secrecy envelope, you have to sign and date it, and then you hand it back right then. So you can vote in person by mail before election day, if that's something that you want to do. But again, it is technically a mail-in ballot that you're submitting in person. But if you want to vote in person and you can't show up on election day, you can go to your county election office and do that. Some key points to remember, and this is where we're getting into the really important stuff. And I know that there's been some confusion about some of this. So first, I just want to remind folks of ID requirements. So if you show up to vote on election day, if it is your first time voting or your first time voting in that precinct, you need an ID. Now, ID laws in Pennsylvania are actually pretty reasonable. And so it can be a photo ID, it can be a student ID, it can be a gun license, it can be a utility bill. There's a lot of options that you can use, but you only need it if you are voting for the first time, you're a first-time voter, or you're voting in your precinct for the first time. Other than that, you should not be asked for voter ID. And so one of the things that we're wanting poll monitors outside the polls to watch is if they're hearing of folks requiring that of all voters or asking for that of all voters, that is something that you should flag to a poll monitor you see outside, because that's not a requirement for all voters. It's important to know the difference between mail-in and absentee ballots. This is a little confusing for folks, and we just recommend that people request a no excuse mail-in ballot. Absentee ballots are still provided if you are going to be out of your district on election day. But there are very set reasons for why you can get an absentee ballot. And we don't want anybody to get confused and get rejected for an absentee ballot because their reason for requesting one doesn't fit the criteria. People might be confused that then they can't vote by mail, and that's not the case. So I would just recommend requesting a no excuse mail-in ballot. Now, the requirements for submitting a mail-in ballot, and this is where some of the confusion has come up. You need to complete your ballot and then fold it and put it in that secrecy envelope and seal the secrecy envelope. Now, some confusion has come up because when it gets really humid outside or wet outside, people can receive their mail-in ballot and that secrecy envelope might already be sealed. There's no shenanigans happening here. It is just sort of an environmental challenge when using these envelopes. So the best advice is to call your county election office. Right now, the counties are saying you can carefully open those secrecy envelopes, put your ballot in and tape it, and they'll accept that. But I would recommend calling your county election office. Make sure you sign and date that mail-in ballot. The date is still required. So in the election code, what we call Act 77, it says that a date is required on these mail-in ballots. We are trying very hard to remove this barrier for people, because it is a reason that ballots are rejected. But folks should know that despite anything you might have heard, there was some legal back and forth happening with cases over the last couple of months. It is the case that right now you must sign and date your mail-in ballot, and the date needs to be the month, the day, and the year, and it should be the day that you've completed the ballot or you're sending it off. So it needs to be a date sometime between when you received the ballot and when you send it back in or you submit it. So please make sure you date that ballot, month, day, and year. So October something or November something, 2024, and your signature, make sure you sign that and that it looks like your signature, it looks like the other documents that you typically sign. And last, I want to let folks know or remind people that it is against the law to handle any other voter's ballots. And so while we know that, spouses might drop both ballots off in the mail, that is technically against the law. And so if you're planning on bringing another person's ballot to the county election office to drop it off, or dropping another person's ballot at a ballot drop box, you need a designated agent form. I think it's really important that folks vote according to the letter of the law to the best of their ability. We just don't want any challenges to anyone's ballot or anyone's right to vote. And so you can get a designated agent form on the Department of State's website. And I'm happy to provide it to Lisa if she wants to distribute that. But it's important that if you plan on helping anybody deliver their ballot to a drop box, a mailbox, the county election office, that you have that designated agent form. It's a very simple form. The voter signs it, authorizing you the ability to handle their ballot, and then you sign it, and that's it. But it's important to have that. So please keep those in mind as you're voting. We want to make sure every vote is counted, like I said. I also want to remind folks that while Election Day is on November 5th, there's a lot that has to happen after November 5th. And so while it is likely that we will have results from 60 counties or so out of the 67 in Pennsylvania, it is possible, because of the number of mail-in and absentee and overseas and military ballots and provisional ballots, that in some of our larger counties, we might not know the unofficial or official results for a little bit of time. And I want folks to know that that doesn't mean that anything has gone wrong or that anything bad has happened. It just takes time to count all of these ballots, and we want to make sure all ballots are counted. Counties cannot start processing mail-in, absentee, provisional, any of those ballots. They cannot start opening the envelopes until Election Day. And so that preparation work just takes time. So I wanted to provide these dates just to let folks know that while November 5th is Election Day, and we are going to have some unofficial results by the end of the night, counties are going to keep counting on Tuesday and Wednesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and into the next week if necessary. The official canvass, that official adjudication, reconciling the number of ballots handed out versus the number of ballots submitted, all of the mail-in ballots, that doesn't have to start until Friday after Election Day. Lots of counties start earlier than that, but it's not required by law to start until that Friday after Election Day. And then as you can see, we have by law certain dates that counties are required to meet, to submit their unofficial results, to submit their audit of those ballots, to certify the election results. And then on December 11th, currently Governor Shapiro, must sign Pennsylvania's certificate of ascertainment, certifying the state's election results. That's the official count. We will know who won Pennsylvania before that. But I wanted to let folks know that there are legal requirements for certification, and that counties will be working very hard in the days following November 5th to get that, to get all of the votes counted. I'm sort of wrapping up here, but I did want to let people know that we have election protection hotlines in various languages for folks. So this is if you are at the polls and you've got a problem or you've got a question about your mail-in ballot or your county election office told you something that sounds funny, please call these hotlines. You can see the English hotline 866 Our Vote. We've got Spanish, Asian languages, and Arabic as well. And so if you have any questions at all, you can call these hotlines. We know that right now counties are getting lots of phone calls, so the wait can be quite long. Voters are having a hard time getting through. If you need to ask someone a question or you need to let someone know something, please feel free to call these hotlines. And last, I'll say, please just make a plan to vote. Check your registration status, find your polling place. You can find out who's on your ballot all at the League of Women Voters website, vote411.org. You can type in your name and your address. You can get a sample ballot. We've submitted questions to all of the candidates running in local, state, and federal offices. You can see the unedited answers to those questions on this website. So if you still are wondering who to vote for, please go to Vote 411. Please check your registration status and find your polling place. And if you have any further questions, the League of Women Voters is here. You can always email us.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Widestrom. And thank you everyone for clicking in and being a part of this incredible gathering. We are at time at 8 p.m. We wanted to offer an opportunity for some Q&A, but I don't see questions asked in the chat. And so I want to offer a minute for anyone who's among the attendees to write your question in. If you have any questions for clarification or something that wasn't covered, go ahead and write it in the Q&A, and that will give us an opportunity to answer any burning questions, not only for you but also for others that might watch this coming up. I'm also going to invite my other panelists to come back, and so maybe some of these questions will be for any one of us. So just want to give a chance. And I'm not seeing any new questions being asked. So it sounds like we did our work. We did our job. Like it was all super, super clear. Well, thank you again, Dr. Widestrom, for this. I mean, really, it was a great training. And for you, Dr. Hart, and Reverend Scott, and Reverend Taylor, and Reverend Dr. Edwards, thank you for sharing your heart, sharing your mind, sharing your spirit with us today, and your faith. And I pray that the work that we have done, the little seeds that we planted tonight, would go far and wide, and that those who need to hear it will hear it. And for those of you who are watching right now, know that this is going to be up on the web on YouTube, and you can find it by looking for Your Vote, Your Voice. Just look for that, Your Vote, Your Voice, and you'll probably find it on several of our websites. And so thank you for checking in today, for getting prepared to vote. Now, what can I say? Let's go out and let's exercise some stewardship of our world. How about that? Huh? All right. God bless you guys. Have a good one.